Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. I'm Nathan Weinstein,
And I'm Brian Counter.
and today we're going to do the first of a recurrent series of sort of free form episodes where Brian and I will just chat about the games that we're playing, the books that we're reading, or essays that we've read recently, songs we're listening to, movies we've seen, etc. Um, and then we'll follow the sort of general conversation up in many cases with a bit of a gimmick where one of us presents to the other one some short text or piece of art or media, and we discuss that in, say, in the back half of the episode. Does that sound right, Brian?
Yeah, that sounds right to me. So basically, we're still figuring out the format, of course, and the schedule for everything, but you can probably roughly expect one of these, I'd say, what, every once a month or so, or every, 4 or 5 episodes, something like that. Uh,
Yeah.
that's not a rule, but, every so often, just kind of to check in and talk about, some stuff that we're not doing explicitly for the podcast, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, and I do feel like I mean, one of the uses of these free form episodes will be to potentially sort of open up organically and discover in the moment angles for future podcasts as well. So part of this we're just doing for us, you know, but the hope is that this will be an entertaining and interesting conversation. I'll also say that our title is a reference to Bloodborne, to Formless Eden or Formless Odin. Do you know how to say his name? Do you know what I'm talking about, Brian?
Vaguely, how is it spelled again?
It's Oedon, I want to say.
Oh yeah, I think that's one of those unpronounceable ones in my head that I don't have.
Exactly.
I don't have a clear it's like a Lovecraftian name, of course. So
Yeah, it would be cool if it was Eden, just for the sort of, I guess, like biblical resonances. But in any way, if Eden or Odin is but I guess both are cool, right? But Eden or Odin is the sort of patron god of a section of Yharnam, the city where Bloodborne, the game, takes place. But he's also known for being formless, and so in that sense, he's the kind of patron saint of our work too, or our thinking, and that we're often interested in places where form seems to be recessive or contradictory, right? Or seems to break down or to become like really hard to find or to sort of articulate. Um, in that sense, he's a particularly important figure for my book on Bloodborne, for one that I just finished. But will maybe come up again and again in our discussions of whatever we're sort of presenting to each other in these conversations.
definitely, yeah, that's a nice connection. And yeah, actually thinking about it now, I believe that in my head, I'm not sure if I've ever said it out loud, but I think the my mental pronunciation of it actually was a more phonetic, like o Oedon or something like that, which may be incorrect as well, but who knows?
Oh, we done. Yeah, a combination of Odin, Eden, and like the Odeon Theater. Isn't that a famous theater in like
Yeah,
Paris or
yeah,
something?
stuff.
So should we start by just saying a bit about stuff we've been reading or playing recently?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go first. I mean, you know this because we've talked about it a bit. Actually, so most of my reading lately has been for teaching. So I'm mostly rereading a lot of stuff. Although I'll maybe save this for a little bit later because it might connect a little bit with the text that I'll be sort of presenting a little later on. But so I'm reading, rereading with my students right now. I've been reading a bunch of stories by Bennett Sims, who I've mentioned before, and we might actually, I think, eventually look at one of his stories together on the podcast. Um, the one that I most recently just read is called House Sitting. It's one of his earlier stories. I believe it came out in 2012 originally, but it's in his 2017 collection, White Dialogues. And it's a really like the more every time I read it, I guess as happens with most texts, the more I read it, the more I notice these really intricate details. And it's kind of no mistake that The epigraph is a epigraph from Thomas Bernhard, which it just says it's from his novel Gargoyles, but the epigraph is spiders as nature's craziness, I often think. Uh, and so there's a big motif of, spiders and webs, and there's like a literal spider that appears at one point. But then there's, of course, this kind of wavering back and forth between, uh, the motif of a web, like the web as a trap, the web as some kind of pattern, and I guess maybe also coming back to that idea of form, right? Like where we have to be to see form. Because form oftentimes maybe can be perspectival as well. It's not simply just objective. And so yeah, I mean it's a story of basically about and it's kind of uniquely, narrated in the second person, so it's a you character. But it's a story about a sort of protagonist who has answered this ad. It's kind of unclear if it was in a newspaper or on online or whatever, to house sit this cabin in the woods. And I think part of what's happening, like narratively, but also I think with what Sims is doing a little more like meta textually or whatever, is playing with these ideas that we have about, yeah, like a cabin in the woods that's creepy. That's material for horror, that's especially off the beaten path, like a cabin that you can't just drive up to, but you have to kind of bushwhack to get to, and it's all overgrown and everything. That's going to lead to some horror that maybe there's a murderer there or something. Maybe there's some kind of crazy bloodbath that you're going to find if you go inside. But instead, we have a really nice work of psychological horror that's also about reading, I think. I don't really want to like give too much away, I guess, but it's about reading and interpretation just as much as it is about fear and the uncanny.
That
Um,
sounds super cool.
yeah.
And I haven't read any Sims. I'm looking forward to, I think we're going to read the Sims story that he has claimed it was partly inspired by the game Silent Hill 2, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
the postcard. Yeah.
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 And that's a game that I've been playing. So I'll sort of, we're hoping to do a podcast on the recent Silent Hill 2 remake sometime in the near future. So I'll sort of save my thoughts on that game for later, but I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah.
Um, I sent you a photo last night, a screenshot on my PS app of a toilet overflowing with shit, which was the most realistic looking shit-filled toilet I'd ever seen in a game, maybe in any piece of media. I don't know. Truly a landmark for asset creation and 3D modeling.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, as far as Bennett, I mean, the story goes, like one thing that it strikes me that as you describe it to me, and I'll say quickly. Spiders as nature's craziness would be a good tagline for many of our discussions about Souls games. So maybe we should say that for every Souls game, in every episode where we talk about Souls. Like, just like work it in somewhere, spiders as nature's craziness.
Yeah. Yeah.
It would work for Skyrim too, I guess.
Sure.
But yes, the conceit that you're describing does sound gamey, like it's not just a reference to horror tropes, but it's also in a way like even down to the second person, which is an oddity of narrative style and form, but in video games and video game writing, kind of the default.
Right.
Right. Like, think of a game like the old text adventure games like Colossal Cave Adventure, which actually begins by saying, you are at the end of a road in a forest, or around you is a forest, and there's a cabin right ahead of you.
Right.
And then goes on to narrate in the second person as you sort of engage with the interface and make various decisions or input commands, and explore this textual hyperspace or whatever. Um, using the second person, and sort of informing you what you, the player, are doing, as a way of sort of giving responses to your actions. So I do feel like there's like a really interesting, strong game resonance there too. Have you ever played any of those text adventures?
I definitely played, emulated versions. I think must have been when I was in high school, so
Yeah.
not anytime recently. But definitely back in the day, I've played. I can't even remember really which ones because I know there were a handful. I mean, my real memory recently of anything having to do with those is Game Life by
Yeah.
Clune, because I know he talks about one of those in the early chapter, I believe.
First chapter, yeah, and I just love that's like one of my favorite bits of game writing ever. I mean, that book is incredible. It's the best book on games, but in particular, like I love that first chapter on text adventures. I also just remember, I'm thinking now of there's a game called Kentucky Route Zero, which is a sort of like point and click adventure game
Mhm.
that came out between I think 2000 maybe 13 and 2020. There's five installments, and they sort of become more and more spaced out, in some ways more ambitious with each one. And that game is sort of also engaging with Colossal Cave Adventure and the history of those sorts of games to the point where you at one point play a version of Colossal Cave Adventure inside the game. In Kentucky Route Zero, it's called Xanadu. And inside the game, the Colossal Cave Adventure game, which happens inside the cave, the actual cave that the game was based on, um, you then start to meet, like encounter characters from the game world itself. So it's actually it feels like it's a great example of the kind of infinite recursion that Borges talks about in in the essay that that you presented. So we can get to that. Maybe we can come back to that when we get to that essay. But the one thing I wanted to say was that I have a colleague here at the University of Utah, Justin Carpenter, who's really fascinated in like mise on a beam structures or infinitely recurring, play within a play, game within a game, within a game within a game structures. And he has a talk and I think a paper or an essay or a chapter on that moment in Kentucky Route Zero. So he would be a great person to bring on at some point too.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah, I've been getting really interested again because I was at one point, but just thinking in a new way, I guess, for myself at least about the mise en abyme and what that does. And I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I do have one other thing though that I've been reading maybe quickly, and then I'll maybe ask what else you've been playing or reading. I've been reading this book called Afterworld by Debbie Urbanski.
Hmm.
So I'm teaching it for the first time. I read it, was it back in the fall or last spring? I actually can't, I think it was back in the fall. Um, and it's yeah, it's not on the face of it, I guess it's not something that I would necessarily think that I would like, but my friend Chris, who has a YouTube channel on literature called Leaf by Leaf, he spoke very highly of it and recommended it to me. I think personally, like I know he made a video about it, but also he ended up interviewing the author, but he also I believe he recommended it to me, so I got a copy. And it's really great. So it's essentially it's sort of like whatever post-apocalyptic novel that is narrated by an AI. Which again, that's like where I'll say that I'm maybe that to me is not something that I'll necessarily be jumping to read when I hear about it. But the writing is just excellent, and the way that I feel like I'm in maybe like teacher mode here because this is a term I've been using so much, but like world building, like the world building of it is pretty incredible.
Hmm.
It's a lot, non-linear text that is kind of uh, I don't know what else to call. I mean, it's kind of collage like, but maybe a better term would be like documentary. Like, so it's basically set almost 100 years in the future where there's been this kind of basically in a bid to let the human or kind of force the human race to die out. There's been this virus release that doesn't kill everybody, but sort of sterilizes everyone. And its aim is sort of to basically allow the Earth to rewild, like without a human population kind of wreaking havoc on the Earth or whatever, or taking the resources. And so it follows one character, but it's a, this character's life is basically assembled, we find out over the course of I think about like 5 minutes of real time because it's a very powerful AI. But this character's life is essentially assembled and sort of narrated to us in the form of I guess a book. It might more properly within the world be considered like a report, I guess, because it is a sort of compilation of a bunch of documents. But sort of along the way, the sort of AI narrator begins to uh, ask a lot of questions about, I don't know, storytelling, how storytelling is related to humanity. What is the sort of boundary between uh, humanity and something like AI? But again, in ways that are probably far more interesting than how it probably sounds right now. I would definitely recommend the book anyway. My students seem to be enjoying it as well.
That sounds really great. I don't know it at all. I wonder. I mean, is it from a recent
Yeah,
decade?
I believe it was published in 2023. Uh,
Okay, cool. So really recent.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
even after like post Chat GPT, or maybe a little
yeah,
before.
yeah. I think in the interview that Chris did with the author, she mentions that she had used Chat GPT for like she had kind of like troubleshooted, I guess, or whatever, troubleshot uh certain aspects of it using Chat GPT.
That's awesome.
Like for instance, like the AI will like one moment that I really like is sort of there's a moment where the characters kind of find out, and this is, again, it's non-linear, so this is like way in the past, I guess, technically in relation to when the story is being told, but there's the moment where the characters find out that this virus has been released.
Hmm.
And there's just this big paragraph where there's just a bunch of back and forth dialogue, but it's not chopped up into different paragraphs. It's all in one paragraph, like a bunch of different people speaking. And the narrator at one point says something to the effect of including, multiple lines of dialogue from multiple speakers in a single paragraph can help convey a frantic pace. And then there's a parenthetical citation of an obviously fake article, but an article that in the world of the novel is like one of the things that this AI has been trained on. Uh,
That's awesome.
so I think like some of that was maybe AI maybe actually did like have a hand in, coming up with fake article titles, which as I'm sure, I mean, maybe maybe you don't, but as my students have uh inadvertently helped me learn is something that AI does. Uh,
Also something that Borges does, we'll
yeah,
talk about. And yeah, I mean, again, another like a sort of emblematic mise en beam structure, a novel about AI written partly, with the help of AI, or at least using AI to double check components or inspire components.
right.
Cool. Well, should I launch into some of the stuff that I've been doing? I think it's like pretty focused or pretty limited in that I haven't been reading a ton these days, other than what I'm reading for my classes. But I have been playing a fair amount of games. I'm making my way through the Tomb Raider Remastered trilogy. It's been like a year-long project. I just finished Tomb Raider 2 and I'm a couple levels into Tomb Raider 3. Um, and I think I'm going to hold off on saying too much about them because I would like to do an episode about these games later. I think they're just brilliant, weirdly underrated or under-discussed games, partly because they're so difficult. They're really spiky. They're really reticent. And impassive in the way that Souls games actually are. I know it's like a cliche to compare any game to a Souls game, but we talk about Souls games on this podcast, and this is a case where Tomb Raider really does earn the comparison. So much of the legacy of that game is Lara Croft and her character design, which is like very obtrusive, like very in your face, but it's like totally antithetical to the way the games actually are, the way they feel to play. These are incredibly quiet games. Like just the silence is sort of deafening. The loneliness, you're not interacting with NPCs. A tiger will run out once in a while, like a crow, a eagle will fly above you or vulture that you have to shoot. But otherwise, you're just kind of wandering recursively through the same essentially open world spaces. Like the levels have no loading screens. They're completely interconnected. Um, and the thing that really resembles Souls games is the way they just don't tell you anything. Like they don't tell you outside of a tutorial mission, which is totally optional, they don't tell you like how, not just like how to do things, but more importantly, like where to go. There's no, for instance, like yellow or white paint telling you you have to climb this ledge. And often the ledges you're supposed to climb are completely counterintuitive. Like even especially now where game spaces have sort of drilled into our minds, what is an interactable ledge and what isn't, or what is a good area to, traversable area and what isn't, or traversable path. Tomb Raider totally blows that up. Like these games, which I'm playing, Tomb Raider 3 was released in 1998, are radically consistent on the level of design, of spatial design. So like every block looks exactly like every other block. Every space, every component of a space has an equivalent level of reality and interactability, which means that you really have to like think and kind of like sometimes uh, uh, make these huge leaps in either logic or just to like spatial thinking in order to figure out where you're supposed to go to progress. You can spend hours just running around in circles with no idea what you're supposed to do. Also, the keys in that game like are not glowing or highlighted or anything. They're just like literally just lying on the ground, and they'll often be like the same color as the ground. So it's basically impossible to see where the keys are in many cases. And you can lose a lot of time that going back and forth without realizing, oh, actually, there was a key on the ground the entire time that I just needed to pick up. Um, have you played those games at all, or have you watched me stream them at all?
I was going to say, I think when I was like a really young kid and um I'm pretty sure I played one of them, but I was so young that I kind of like don't really remember. And I definitely did not get very far in it. I think it was one of those games where I kind of just like didn't have the patience for it at the time. But watching you stream it somewhat recently, this was a maybe I don't know, I'd say maybe a month or so ago, maybe a little longer, really made me want to play it. I've unfortunately like not been able to catch you on stream recently, but next time you're playing that, I definitely want to make sure I can, at least put it on because I that's one of the things I kind of noticed. The first thing you said is this kind of silence of it. That's yeah, not necessarily what I would associate with just like the idea of the franchise, but
Yeah, yeah, it's incredibly difficult, sort of obscure, not the opposite of user friendly. And it requires so much patience. It's the antithesis to like what a kid would want to play, you know?
Right.
Um, at least a kid who wants like instant gratification. Of course, kids have amazing capacity for wonder and engrossment. And that's really what it was for me. I played them when I was 11 and 10, and they just like blew my mind once I got on their wavelength. But I was used to like Crash Bandicoot or Mario, and I was like, this is so boring. Um, but then I realized it was an entire interactive world, a world filled with like these just exquisitely modeled spaces and vast spaces that still are really cool looking even today. So I'm working on a piece. I'm writing a little bit with Sam Tet, who was recently on to talk about Skyrim.
Mm.
We're sort of doing a collaborative piece on Tomb Raider because it was a really significant series for both of us when we were kids. So I'll save that for, we can maybe let's put a pin in that and come back to Tomb Raider later, maybe when I finish the whole remastered trilogy. Um,
That's
the
great.
other game I've been playing, I actually just finished, is Monster Hunter Wilds. This just came out. I think it came out in like late February. I bought it on release. Um, and it kicks ass, man. It's such a great game. It's one of my favorite games of the last several years, honestly. I think it's had a somewhat mixed response among Monster Hunter fans who are like total sickos. Like Monster Hunter fans are a lot like Souls fans in that they're really, really obsessive and have really strong opinions. The series has traditionally had a really high barrier to entry. It's just incredibly complicated. In terms of its systems, its gear, its builds, and then its combat is really complex too. You have at this point, I think 14 different weapons, and every weapon is far more complex than any Souls weapon, in terms of all the different moves it has. They have individual mechanics, individual controls. It's almost like having 10 different games in one, as far as the fighting goes.
Mm.
Um, but Wilds is the first open world game in the series. It is a really deluxe game. Like just it looks fantastic. There's some performance issues, but the quality of like the character models, the monsters, the locations you traverse, the sort of little details like the food that you're eating, or the camps that you're setting up. Everything just looks so good. It has a really, really attractive visual style. Um, And yeah, it's just I think for me, it was just at the sweet spot in terms of length. I think some complaints have been that there's not enough content in the game. I played for 60 hours because I have no life and basically got all the gear that I wanted. It's the game revolves around, you want to, there's a set progression of fights that you have to win and, a set progression of monsters, a linear progression that you defeat. But the real like endpoint of the game, it's one of these infinite open-ended games like Diablo, where you're trying to get better and better gear, and you can just sort of keep playing it ad infinitum, trying different builds, right? Getting progressively better stuff. So the end point is kind of not when you finish the story, right? Or not when you finish all of the challenges that you want to do, but actually just when you have the gear that you want, which is itself a kind of funny thing, because you would think that getting the best gear would mean like I need the best gear so I can kill more monsters, right? It's the same in any loot-based game or the Neo games, which I've mentioned on this pod before, or again Diablo, where the end game is grinding for or constructing, right, gathering resources for the best equipment, but it's really more a status symbol. Like you're not getting that equipment so that you can then use it to beat really difficult enemies. In fact, like at least when I play, like when I get max equipment, then I'm like, okay, I'm done the game. That's it. That's my reward. I don't even need to enjoy my reward. But I've hit this endpoint um, where I've sort of perfected something that's intended for or valued for its utility, like a really, really powerful armor set or sword, but I'm actually not putting it to use. It's kind of a weird paradox of
Right.
how in-game loot grinds work.
Yeah, I feel like that. I'm trying to think because I'm pretty sure. Um, no, I haven't played those games, but you showed me, I think you sent me a couple, maybe a video of them.
Mhm.
And I didn't realize there were so many. I just looked it up. There were just a ton of them. But no, I'm just about the idea of this is maybe a topic for a different time. Maybe we can think about this in some kind of segment or future episode. But yeah, having your reward essentially coincide with the end of the game is kind of an odd. And I know I've played games where that happens, but I guess I'm just kind of unable to think of an example right now. But
Yeah, I mean, it can happen in Skyrim too, or even when I'm like perfecting a build in Elden Ring, although that's a bit different because I usually end when I've defeated all the remembrance bosses.
yeah, yeah,
But yeah, like it's the feeling, it's like one of those quintessential video game feelings of like, hell yeah, I got the ultimate weapon. Now I can finally quit the game. You know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's such a funny, thought process, but it does. I mean, maybe it's telling us that what we really want, I don't know, is not to kill the enemies, or maybe what we really want is the object, or maybe it's like, buying a Ferrari without any intention of ever driving 250 miles an hour on the highway or something. I have no idea. We can talk about this down the line.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I think we
but
should.
the other thing about Monster Hunter is just that it has a lot of Souls DNA, or rather, Souls has a lot of Monster Hunter DNA.
Mhm.
Still a similar kind of lock-on combat, although melee-based combat. Although, as in Souls and Monster Hunter in particular, it's actually better not to lock on. At least that's my understanding. I've played about 80 hours of Monster Hunter World and then Monster Hunter Rise. Those are the two previous games in the series, and World was like the big mainstream break for the series. Brought it fully into the PS4 generation. It's like sumptuous graphics, elaborate open environments, huge spectacle, like an incredible spectacle with the monsters, and all that's amplified in Rise, or sorry, in Wilds.
Mhm.
But yes, like you often don't want to lock on. It's better to play without lock on in the way that, in Bloodborne, a lot of the big monsters you often, or really any Souls game, it's often better to have total freedom of movement rather than having relative movement because
Right.
it makes it easier to dodge these giant flailing creatures. And then the creature design itself, it's often goofier than Souls, but it still has that same like you're just fighting a roster of epic dragons basically, and a lot of them feel very much like the dragon fights in Souls games or the giant beast fights. Like there's that spiritual or spirit antelope thing in or spirit moose in Elden Ring. You know what I'm talking about? In
Yeah,
Sails
yeah,
of the River.
yeah.
That's like pretty much a Monster Hunter fight, you know. And then the Baal, the dragon, or Plasudasax, the dragon, you know, these big spectacle fights where like particle effects are everywhere. They're like shooting fire or lasers and whatever, and you're running around um and then running up and smashing them. That's very Monster Hunter as well. So it is kind of like, for those who haven't played it, I would describe it as imagine the Bale fight in in Shadow of the Erd Tree, but kind of repeated with variations 20 to 30 times, and that's your game. And in between it, you're exploring maps, but you're not, there's no fodder enemies. It's not like you're fighting a bunch of grunts and then fighting the boss. It's just boss battle, boss battle, boss battle.
Hmm.
But the bosses are located in these incredibly dynamic, incredibly exquisitely detailed sort of ecological systems. It reminds me a lot of the game Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, which had this like forest with, you know, bees and snakes, and little creatures, frogs, I think sometimes insects, and then different kinds of flora, and then larger wildlife as well. And all of that was interactable. Everything had some kind of gameplay function, and sometimes they would interact with each other. Like you could knock down a beehive, and the bees would then irritate the guards who would run away, etc. That's how Monster Hunter is, but on a much larger scale. Scale of just massive open world environments where you just roam around, you find the monster you're hunting, and then you often fight them while engaging with the environment in really meaningful ways. You know, there's a level where there's like a giant dam, like a river's dammed up, and you can like fight the monster in front of the dam and then break the dam, and like a flood of like a tsunami will roll out and knock the monster over and give you free hits. There's a lot of stuff like that, kind of environmental interactables or traps, but also really small stuff like just picking herbs or picking, yeah, different kinds of flowers or mushrooms like you do in Skyrim, you know, to use to craft potions or to give yourself various buffs. And what's cool is that all these things are constantly active at the same time. Like the worlds are incredibly dynamic, incredibly um, rich with significant sort of particles of interaction, you know. So there's a feeling of real like plenitude and like luxury when playing these games, even though the core loop is much simpler than it is for a game like Elden Ring, in that it's just all about fighting giant monsters.
I see. Yeah, that sounds wow, yeah, I guess I'll have to try that one at some point.
So that's it for me. I mean, do you want to move on to this short story that you wanted to talk about today?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean I guess I'll just sort of start by introducing it a little bit, right? So the story that I'll talk a little bit about today is Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote by Jorge Luis Borges. This is certainly one of his classic stories. I mean, when I think of this one, when you think of Borges, you have to think about what? Garden of Forking Paths, Library of Babel, maybe Funes the Memorious, maybe the Book of Sand. I would number this story among them, right? And this is a story where I guess to call it a story is as I've been, increasingly beginning to characterize Borges in my mind is, his fiction. Um, there are a few things about it. I mean, of course, he does have some fiction that is actually narrative, but a lot of it feels much more essayistic. And he did, of course, write a lot of essays about literature as well. But this is one that feels quite a bit more essayistic. It feels also has another characteristic of a lot of his writing, which is that it also feels kind of like a sort of, somewhere in between an essay and a narrative that is maybe uh, playing out some kind of philosophical concept or thought experiment, maybe. And the other thing about it as well is, that he's also just kind of showing you how much he's read, but not just that, not just showing you how much he's read, but also like how important literature is, to him and to his kind of experience of the world. And so I think we talk, I think something earlier. I mean, maybe you said this about house sitting, about it feeling like a, the second person feels kind of like a game-like thing. And I would say that for me, Borges feels very, very game-like. I think that there's maybe a misunderstanding, or like one version of that could be that he feels playful, which at times certainly he does, but that's not exactly what I mean. Maybe I'll try to explain what I mean while walking through this story a little bit. But essentially, so the we have a narrator who, um, is friends with this author named Pierre Menard, right? So that the text kind of begins with a numbered, or sorry, a lettered list of all of Pierre Menard's visible works. So this is how the narrator puts it. This is the visible work of Menard in chronological order. And so it's, we can look at it, it kind of just looks like some, maybe French writer in the 1920s or something who's, yeah, publishing some sonnets, publishing some kind of symbolist stuff. There's an article against Paul Valéry, which was published even though they were friends, and they're like not, he's publishing the opposite. So it's basically like a, kind of a French symbolist poet. You can think of someone like Valéry or Mallarmé, or one of these poets who were really interested in this kind of maybe materiality of the world, of the word, sorry, like the written word, and how yeah, and how poetry and literature have this kind of ability to be these odd, kind of beautiful objects in the world, right? Not,
Mhm.
and in some way kind of standing outside of time as well, which is, I think, is kind of one of the things that we get a comment on in this story.
Should we add quickly, just for this night, this early 20th century or late 19th century symbolist context, that Borges himself is writing this in what, 1939? So
Yes,
it's a
yeah,
little bit post the symbolist movement, such that we can speak of one,
right.
but still basically dealing with what would pass then as a modern current of thought and art, a thought about art.
Right. Would yeah, yeah, thanks for adding that. So that, which is what makes Borges like so, I guess, so perceptive and so incredible to be writing this, not too long after it, right? I mean, this is not coming like 100 years after it. This is and I guess, time will be something that's pretty important to talk about here as well. But anyway, our narrator then kind of tells us that actually the real masterpiece, or the real thing that this guy Pierre Menard was writing, that he had spent kind of all his time working on, is to write Don Quixote by Cervantes. So not to copy it, not to not to sit down and, as if he were tracing a drawing, like, reproduce it as a copyist or something, but actually and this is what Borges says. So his admirable intention was to produce a few pages which would coincide word for word and line for line with those of Miguel de Cervantes. And so, of course, this is somebody who's writing, you know, writing in the 1920s or whatever, who's trying to write a text which was written in the 1600s, right?
Mhm.
Don Quixote.
Yeah,
Uh,
early 1800s.
And so, on the face of it, I guess the reason I'm so interested in the story and why I've been thinking about it lately is that, I mean, one, the form is weird. We could maybe talk a little bit about like the form of this as basically an essay about kind of an invented author with a kind of ridiculous task. But that ridiculousness is really the other thing that I think is interesting, right? So a lot of times with Borges, it feels and I think this is what sets Borges apart from maybe some of the more. This is why I say that I don't think Borges is necessarily, like, if he's being playful, that's almost like a nice little stylistic tick, but he's doing something that's a lot more serious. And so I also, Nathan, I sent you this essay, which was I guess a review of At Swim Two Birds by Flann O'Brien, but he only mentions At Swim Two Birds kind of in like the penultimate paragraph, and that's it.
Yeah.
And he also like he kind of like gets a couple things wrong about it, I think, like some of the his descriptions about it, about the novel are like a little bit inaccurate. This is one of the things that I also like just read. So I kind of have this on my mind as well. And I also have to maybe shout out my good friend Joseph Labine who sent me this. I wasn't aware of this review, so he we were reading some Borges together, and he came to present in my class, and he sent me this, which I hadn't read before, this essay. So um so anyway, this essay that he has is all about, it's called When Fiction Lives in Fiction, and it's all about essentially the idea of the mise en abîme, right? So this idea of to mise en abîme just literally means to place something into the abyss, right? So you can think of my image of this, or the image that might come to mind, is if you ever I remember like eating in restaurants that have mirrors on like two walls, and you like sit there and you just, if you look into one of the mirrors, you just see a infinite number of versions of yourself there, right?
Yeah, dude, I had that in my childhood. It's still, my parents still live in the same place in South Philly. But my childhood home, the bathroom had that precisely that effect, which maybe is why I'm now a literary scholar.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, look, this seems to be like a almost like an origin story for Borges here. This is what he's talking about. He talks about um yeah, the very first sentence, I owe my first inkling of the problem of infinity to a large biscuit tin that was a source of vertiginous mystery during my childhood. On one side of this exceptional object was a Japanese scene. I do not recall the children or warriors who configured it, but I do remember that in the corner of the image, the same biscuit tin reappeared with the same picture, and in it the same picture again, and so on, at least by implication, infinitely. I actually have some kind of, I think it's actually like some kind of tin of cocoa or something that has the same thing on it. Um, but this idea that, okay, so I'm going to have I mean, the kind of a little bit more vulgar way of it is a story within a story, or, we just call it metafiction or whatever. Um, the kind of endlessly, whatever you want to call it, like Russian doll version, where there's like another one inside of, whatever the form is, there's another like kind of reduplication of that form inside of it. Um, I mean, there is, I think, probably no way to actually have an infinite version of that, like at least literarily. I'm not really sure like how you would trace out an infinite recursion like that. It always has to be by implication, I think, as Borges says, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry. Do you mind if I just jump
no,
in and
go,
say
yeah, go ahead.
quickly?
Yeah.
Maybe it's impossible, but I would like, it would be cool to try. And I'm thinking now that if we ever change our podcast image, which I don't know why we ever would, but it's probably the best part of this podcast, honestly. But if we did, maybe we could commission an artist to do something with like a biscuit tin that recedes to infinity,
Oh,
maybe
wow.
with our faces on it or something.
Or it's in or the book that's the book I'm holding on the image has an image of me holding the book, and it just
Yeah. And maybe we can just Photoshop in a biscuit tin just as a little nod to Borges somewhere.
yeah, yeah, that would be nice. Yeah. Because I'm sure there were biscuits around back in the day. So
Yeah, and there's like a Bloodborne theme. Obviously, we have the sort of copy pasted, photoshopped Bloodborne HUD in that image, and a biscuit tin feels like an object. You never find it in Elden Ring or Dark Souls, but you could very well find a biscuit tin in Bloodborne. It has that kind of late Victorian
yeah.
sort of like industrial association or fittingness.
Yeah, it'd be like a one of those objects that you can't do anything with it, right?
Right, it would say like already eaten or something.
Or stale or something.
Yeah. Yeah, just stale, period.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, so the thing, the thing that I maybe that Borges helps me think through a little bit, which and I think it's appropriate that um the story that, or the novel that Pierre Menard is trying to, write again is Don Quixote, which, in certain regards does have some qualities that could be perhaps called postmodern, right? And I mean, I just recently last summer read Tristram Shandy, which same thing, right? It has that kind of joking, whatever, like this kind of digressive attitude, this kind of uh weird, sort of nonlinear metafiction. There are tons of stories within it. There's and so like a lot of what happens in the 20th century with the so-called postmodern novelists, I think about John Barth or William Gaddis or William Gass. And those are all like the really good ones, but there are of course also versions of this that are a lot less interesting and are and I think there's like kind of an image, right? Like the kind of attractive image of postmodernism as some kind of game, right? Like some kind of sort of playful like trickery, and you have to have metafiction and you have to have a story within a story and whatever. And so there is a version of that I think that exists out there, or at least an understanding of it like that. And then there's what Borges is doing here, which is I think I mean, the way he talks about the mise en abîme is not just because it's cool or whatever, right? It's because it points to the problem of infinity, right? So I think of like the just the term that comes to mind is like profundity, right? Like both, I guess both meanings of profundity, like both to be like literally deep, like the abyss is deep, right? It's like endless. It's if you're placed into the abyss, if you're meased on a beam, you're in the depths somewhere, right? And I guess this is like where we could also maybe talk about games again as well, but there's also like a serious philosophical weight to this problem, right? And so that weight gets located in certain particular places, but it's still maybe a version of the same problem, whether that's form or absence of form or formlessness. Um, and so the gambit, which at first glance seems a little bit ridiculous, like why is this 1920s French guy trying to rewrite the Quixote? We already have it, right? Like that is itself whatever, like a thing that Don Quixote himself would do, right? Because it's a ridiculous thing to do. Uh, but at the same time, what does our narrator learn from this? I mean, we get at the end, we have this like I think it's really subtle, but a really important use of the term palimpsest. So near the end of the story, he says, um, there's nothing new in these nihilistic verifications. What is singular is the determination Menard derived from them. He decided to anticipate the vanity awaiting all man's efforts. He set himself to an undertaking which was exceedingly complex and from the very beginning futile. He dedicated his scruples and his sleepless nights to repeating an already extant book in an alien tongue. He multiplied draft upon draft, revised tenaciously, and tore up thousands of manuscript pages. He did not let anyone examine these drafts and took care that they should not survive him. In vain have I tried to reconstruct them. I have reflected that it is permissible to see in this final Quixote a kind of palimpsest, through which the traces, tenuous but not indecipherable, of our friend's previous writing should be translucently visible. Unfortunately, only a second Pierre Menard, inverting the other's work, would be able to exhume and revive those lost Troys. So,
Hmm.
in other words, and I think this is like a really, this is a really beautiful a way of thinking about it. And this is perhaps like a game, something that I think about with games. This is not like games in the sense of playing, being able to play the Quixote or whatever, but there is something that I think we've talked about, which is that, when you interact with a work, first of all, like on just on the basic level, right, whether it's a game or a work of literature, that thing does even if even if it's not in the kind of crass way of, oh, this thing changed my life or whatever, right? Which I guess that's not crass, but it is kind of a cliche, right? Like this book changed my life, or this, whatever, this work of art, really changed the way I see the world or something thematically. There's that. But I think there's also kind of like a more experiential or phenomenological way that games and literature and other forms of art do make a mark on us. Like they do write they write on us, I guess, if that's like if I can put it that way, right? And so like palimpsest is almost a reversible term here, I kind of think about. So on the one hand, the narrator is like he's returning to read, Don Quixote, and he says that basically he can't read it anymore without imagining and not just because it's his friend, like, oh, I imagine my friend writing this, I feel sad that he never completed it or whatever, but just imagining, like, involuntarily that this bears the traces of not only Pierre Menard's, identical copies of those fragments or whatever, but his other work, right? So we have to go back to the list of his, 20 something different articles and experimental sort of, poems and symbolist poems and chess problems and, responses to different philosophers and things like that. So on the one hand, the work itself, like, the work itself is a kind of palimpsest, right? So the final Quixote is a kind of palimpsest through which the traces of our friend's previous writing should be translucently visible. But then at the same time, when we undergo this kind of, again, even as like a sort of outside observer looking at what seems to be the most ridiculous thing, if you had a friend who said, hey man, I'm gonna I'm basically gonna stop all my other work and I'm just gonna, yeah, pretty much gonna try to rewrite the Odyssey or whatever in ancient Greek, Um, that's just a stupid, that's kind of a ridiculous thing to do. And yet, I mean, there is some implication to that, right? Like to not to and also this is a question about like the classics as well, right? So the Quixote is like considered like the first modern novel or the first Western novel or whatever, right? I mean, it's a classic that is often referred to. I mean, so many uh yeah, I mean, it's a canonical text, so it's not, and I think that's important as well. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's also just such I mean, it's worth maybe just underscoring that fact for those who haven't, I mean, read Don Quixote because it so saturates even our culture, right? Not just in Spain, but in just in the West. It's such a familiar story, and yet the kind of, as you pointed out, the actual form of it is so just crazy,
yeah,
from the
yeah,
very beginning of the 1600s, like 1605 maybe, and then 1615, something like that. The dates are wrong, but it's, I think, ballpark around there. I mean, this is a story where, yes, we have the basic meta element where Don Quixote, this old, aristocrat, tries to reenact chivalric romances, knight stories of knights and such, in at the time modern, the modern world. And so there's a ridiculous, just incongruity between the tales that he lives inside of, right? These virtues for
right,
virtual reality that he projects, where windmills are actually giants, and he has to charge them with his lance,
yeah,
um, and what they actually are, right? Like modern technology windmills, and this ridiculous guy in an old creaky armor. But that's just the first level of reflexivity, because it really gets crazy in the second. I forget what the actual names of the divisions are, but I'm going to say the second volume, where after quite many years, Cervantes goes back and writes more, adds more to the Quixote,
mhm,
and there, like, Don Quixote has, in fact, as in real life, become famous as a story. So
right,
people meet him and they're like, "Oh, we know about you from the book," you know. It's really trippy. And then there's even a false Quixote. So I think there were historically, again, I could be totally wrong. It's been a while since I've read the book, but um, there were like many. Quixote was so popular that there was a bunch of like knockoff Quixotes or stories about Don Quixote
right,
that were not written by Cervantes. And so part two, Don Quixote is also like not just, doesn't just have this relationship to medieval romances, but also to like the fake Quixotes that are circulating. And he's like, I'm the real Quixote or whatever.
right,
I'm just kind of ad-libbing because I do forget the details, but it is just straight out of a postmodern work of metafiction. It's just striking how radical in that sense it is, even maybe even more so in some ways, because it's also like a novel, because it also has a kind of sincerity, one could say, in the story that it wants to tell, and in the sort of representation of a world and of characters. Um, and
mhm,
that is, I mean, I've always been interested. I'm now just thinking of one of my. I had a brilliant student named Alex last year in my video game narratives class, and Alex wrote about the game Inscription, which is also an amazing game. We should talk about that. A meta, sort of a meta card game.
Mm.
But uh, the they wrote a paper like where they argued that uh, despite the kind of reflexivity about the game medium, it's ultimately a really sincere story, and that actually makes it better than
Yeah.
if we're just
Yeah.
like kind of cheeky and ironic and like, hey, look at all the weird stuff we can do, or like, look how
Right.
experimental.
Yeah.
Um, that's how, honestly, that's sort of how I take a game like Undertale, which I know is really well regarded among games players, especially players, who are interested in like whatever books and stuff. But I actually find that a bit cloying and irritating. Whereas Inscription, because it is just a very straightforward story about a cursed game,
Mm.
the meta-ness is like supplementary to the story. It's not like just the main point of the story. Um,
Yeah.
I
I
just
mean,
wanted to say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, no, no, no. I'm just that's kind of that's what I'm saying about Borges too, right?
Right.
And I think that's like all good. I mean, just it doesn't matter what kind of literature, right? That's like that's what good art is or whatever. This kind of, it anyone can as the as the narrator here says that it would be easy to just rewrite or to write a new Quixote, right? uh
Yeah.
this is what he says. He did not want to compose another Quixote, which is easy. uh so that I think that's maybe a nod to that as well, right? And this is like a totally uh this is also true of Borges, right? It's probably not too difficult to write in this style. You could make lists and do some kind of like weird thing with time or have some kind of mise en abîme sort of thing happening in your text, but it's still not going to have maybe the weight that something like this does.
Yeah, for sure. And the more you say mise en abîme too, I'm backtracking a bit, but I love the way that you literalized it, and brought up the just side of the actual, imagistic naturalized depiction that the term references, which is of actually being suspended in an abyss, and that, as you say, that is what's fascinating to Borges is not just, oh, look, what isn't it crazy when a book is about a book? But
Yeah.
the implication that that leads to infinity, and infinity is a sublime concept and a
Yeah.
difficult concept.
Yeah.
And so the idea of like actually an infinite abyss,
Mhm.
um, there are Dark Souls resonances here too, though of course, in the abyss in Dark Souls, you still stand on a floor. Uh,
Right.
so it's not actually infinite in that way. We can talk about that when we cover Dark Souls.
Mhm.
But as we continue to talk about mise en abîme, I do think, yeah, I just want to sort of even like say more strongly that we have to have Justin Carpenter on because
Mhm.
um, I could be totally misquoting or just botching his his arguments and his work. So maybe when he comes on, he can correct me and scold me. But I want to say that he has an argument that basically video games are mise en abîme in a way inherently because of some sort of perpetual feedback between the player and the game. Again, could be wrong, but I know I do remember I've seen him give versions of this paper before, and it's a really brilliant, really fascinating paper. So let's definitely book him if he's free.
Yeah, that sounds great. um yeah, I mean, yeah, just I mean, this is just kind of an errant thought here, because I don't know that I have too much more to say, but yeah, I'll just kind of agree that, like infinity, and this is where this is the thing that maybe draws together, I guess, at least everything I've read by Borges, which is that we have these kind of maybe sometimes mathematical, or sometimes again students a lot of times want to say, oh, that's like that thought experiment of this or that, right? Like like for example, Library of Babel is like it could be, actually I think a few different thought experiments or whatever. You could kind of have a popular pop culture version of that goes in a couple different ways, but there is always this like really profound like feeling to it, I mean, like for instance, Garden of Forking Paths, the first time I read it, I remember like crying at the end, like it's a really and it's it is kind of like there's a twist ending, and whatever, there's all this foreshadowing, and there's all these it's kind of like a play on a what almost feels for a moment like it might be some kind of spy spy narrative or whatever. But then we have all these things that happen, from the narrative voice that really have tons of pathos, right? And even something like this, right? I mean, there's a sense that what Pierre Menard is doing is just futility. There's nobody's going to understand it, right? Like even we are coming into it as I mean, I kind of approach this story at least as, this is almost like, what is this going to be? Is this like a obituary notice or something, like an in memoriam of Pierre Menard after he dies? Is this an introduction to his collected works that the author has, instead of introducing his collected works, just, decided to spend all the time talking about the Quixote, right? And his kind of right. So it's kind of funny because when you look at this again, this other essay that I sent you, there's it's ostensibly a review of At Swim Two Birds, but there's exactly, it's already short, but there's exactly one paragraph about that novel,
Yeah.
and everything else is kind of, I mean, however, without mentioning that novel, everything else is incredibly laudatory about At Swim Two Birds, right? Even without mentioning it, which I think is another thing that Borges does really nicely is showing us or pointing us toward kind of like an empty space that we have to fill, or that we have to kind of continue thinking about. Because if infinity is as you said, like a sublime problem or a sublime concept, and that also means that we can like never be done with it, right? Like we can never be done thinking it. So even if it's the same problem every time, it's going to be endlessly generative, and that's, I mean, actually that maybe takes me nicely full circle to end here and say that that's maybe like what is potentially game like, about Borges's his writing.
Yeah, I love that. And on that note, on the note of perpetually in process, right? Perpetually unresolved. I now just off the top of my head am wondering if I can propose a kind of recurring feature of these freeform or rather formless episodes, which is that um, I wonder if it would make sense to have a kind of like final enigma or something, in the text or work that we're discussing. And I'll nominate one right now. A final enigma in that like just a question we're left with that
Sure.
requires further thought that we don't even have time to get into now, but it's worth just registering. And for me, the thing that I was struck by reading this is a play between and with the ideas of contingency, or we could sort of say randomness
Mhm.
and necessity,
Yeah.
or we could say inevitability. Because Pierre Menard says, and he points out that whereas other great works of a given culture, I'll throw out like Hamlet, for instance, or the Odyssey, even though these aren't his examples, seem like they're necessary. Like we can't conceive of the ancient Greek world without the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Right.
He claims like we can conceive of 1600s Spain without the Quixote. He says the Quixote is a contingent book. The Quixote is unnecessary.
Right.
And and yet, like if what distinguishes the Quixote is a kind of happenstance, it seems it's weird or interesting that Menard's approach to writing the Quixote, or rewriting it, or rather like, I don't know, simply re-manifesting it or something, or re-realizing it, or just maybe realizing it. I don't know what the right word is because rewriting sounds like he's just copying, and he's not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, is it seems to be premised on an ideal of like total determinism. I mean, I know it's discarded, but his initial idea is that, well, how do I rewrite the Quixote? One way would just to become Cervantes.
Yeah.
So in the 1920s or whenever he's writing, to have all of the experiences that Cervantes had. First method he conceived was relatively simple. Know Spanish well, recover the Catholic faith, fight against the Moors or the Turk, forget the history of Europe between the years of 1602 and 1918, be Miguel Cervantes. And the idea there is that, like, actually, that art or writing follows a rigorously deterministic logic, where at a certain level of like, it's obviously incalculable for us, but at some abstract level of potential calculation, if you repeat the exact same experiences of somebody else, you could produce the exact same chain of phonemes, right? Or words or marks on a page,
Yeah.
which seems on the surface absurd. And yet it's a very, I mean, it's a really provocative notion here. We have this later in the same paragraph. Menard says, my undertaking is not difficult, essentially. I should only have to be immortal to carry it out. So the idea is if I had infinite time, and, it may be impossible for a human, but from the perspective of a god, if I could, or a computer, right? If I could simply reconstruct everything, then I would ultimately reconstruct the same novel as well.
Yeah, and,
Um,
and that's the same problem as the Library of Babel, right? I mean, all Borges's stories are kind of adjacent in terms of that
right,
question, I think.
right, right. And so we could say that ultimately this project by this fictional person, right, this fictional writer, Pierre Menard, to reproduce Don Quixote is an enterprise of taking something essentially random and contingent and trying to make it necessary.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure which has more force or which has more weight or which we're supposed, as readers, are supposed to sort of believe. Like, are we supposed to believe in the contingency of life and literature and the idea that that gives it power, which is I feel like I'm now just sort of paraphrasing or thinking of your own work, Brian, too, on aesthetic experience and its relationship to chance. Or should we think of art as a system that's completely predictable from a certain godlike point of view?
I mean, that's, because this is what Deleuze says somewhere, which is that it's the contingency of I can't remember, because he repeats himself quite a bit, but I forget if he's writing about Proust or if he's writing just more generally about like his idea of thought, this idea of thought as something which is uh perhaps violent and contingent. He says that it's the con something to the effect of it's the contingency of these encounters which lends them their necessity.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I think, I mean, you can't have. I think the point maybe is that you can't have one without the other. And I mean, if you look a little bit further, I didn't mention this, but I guess on page 43 of this edition of Labyrinths, there's the two identical passages that are quoted, right? So one of them is Cervantes, right? So he first quotes, and it's the same exact passage. So, truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. So it's just some line from the Quixote, right? So that's Cervantes. Okay, it's kind of and he gives his commentary on it, right? The enumeration is a mere theoretical praise of history. Menard, on the other hand, writes, and it's the same lines. And then, the author here is kind of raving about it, right? History, the mother of truth. The idea is astounding. Why? Well, because now Menard is, as he says, a contemporary of William James, right? And so there's a different understanding of history. So I mean, this is something I think about a lot. Even two things which are materially identical are not the same, right? Two things that are exactly the same are not the same. There's another passage that I think of a lot. In a different story by Borges called The Lottery in Babylon, where it's some version of a lottery. And again, it's one of those strange texts that's not a narrative. There's kind of the narrator is just kind of this seems like this person who's basically writing a history of this series of lotteries that happened within this society. And there's at one point, they keep kind of escalating what the lottery is. So at first, it was the easy lottery. You just enter and maybe if you win some money and that's it. There's no risk. People didn't really care about it because there was no risk. But then the lottery starts to introduce like negative outcomes. And so there's basically an anecdote, which was a big turning point for this part of the lottery, which is there's a slave who steals a ticket. And now the lottery or the lot, I guess, which is on the ticket is to have hot burning irons applied to the tongue.
Mhm.
However, the penalty for theft of the ticket is also to have hot irons applied to the tongue. So now there was a dispute about whether, I mean, either way, the outcome is the same, right? But is it going to be because of the what the ticket decrees, or is it going to be because of the punishment for stealing the ticket? Uh,
Mhm.
and so, this is also something about fate, and I guess contingency in that way as well. So it's not only material, it's also, experiential or evental, I guess, if that's the word.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think of like a game too, like where, you get killed by two things at once. Like you get killed by a monster and by lava, and the game needs to decide which one has priority. Like animation to trigger, does it
Yeah.
trigger the lava death or does it trigger the monster death? Like what would happen if they were at exactly the same, like actually exactly at the same time,
Right.
Would
Yeah.
it break the game? Maybe. If we're talking Skyrim, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that moment where we have quotations right from Pierre Menard's Quixote and from Cervantes' Quixote and different analyses of each quotation, and they're contrasted, and yet the quotations are identical. It is this beautiful, it's like the highlight for me, climax of the
Yeah.
story. And I have no idea what Borges's composition process was, but you can certainly imagine like a version of it where this was the image he had in his head, and then everything builds toward it. What if I had a story like what if I wrote something where I quoted the same lines twice, but they were radically different.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I mean, on that, on the gesture toward, yet another Borges story, and we should just sort of again mention that Borges came up in our very first episode. I'm pretty sure you mentioned that story about another story about a labyrinth, which maybe we
Yes.
can do on a future episode.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, but that seems as good a place as any to end. We've come from a potential future tagline, what spiders are nature's craziness, to to our paradox of the week or our enigma of the week, which was what's the quine the quine the line from Deleuze. It's the contingency of experience gives its necessity or something like that.
Thing along those lines. Yeah, I think it's the contingent nature of these encounters is what lends them their necessity, something like that. Which I love.
Great.
I mean, which is a great thought, right? I mean, that's one of my favorite things that Deleuze ever wrote, I think, because I think it's very hard to capture that, right? I mean, this is the whole problem. This is why I think Borges is so fascinating, because it's that's basically something that's pretty impossible to capture, right?
Yeah, for sure. And so the whole point of Enigma of the Week is that we sort of leave it unresolved. So that's something we'll just have to think about moving forward or not. Maybe we discard it and we pick it up, months from now.
Sure.
Um, but in any event, let's wrap for today, and we'll be back next week with an episode talking about another game, TBD.
Yes.
But in the meantime, Brian, remember, keep that magic lantern lit.
Thank you. I will. Bye bye.